Peter Boghossian taught at Portland State University until he saw how DEI turned our education system into social justice factories where grievance and division are the only outputs. While Peter and I disagree on some issues, we found common ground on the fact that our education institutions need to be abandoned and started anew. Virtues such as truth and courage need to be at the foundation of what we teach. We also discussed his work on Streit epistemology. Can you change the minds of a brainwashed American youth? Peter is optimistic and has a formula to share. Professor, I am really happy that you're here. You know why I'm happy you're here? Because we actually disagree about a lot of stuff.
Right.
And I think that we agree on one very fundamental important thing, and that is having conversations, civil discourse, and pursuing truth.
Correct.
And we may not come with the same conclusions, but I think that us sitting down and conversing about ideas is really important. So thank you for coming. Welcome to PragerU.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to add to that list because I think those are really important lists. I also think we agree, and correct me if I'm wrong, so truth, freedom of speech, these things are core principles. But we also agree on the idea of cognitive liberty. Mm-hmm. I don't want to impose my lack of belief or belief on you. I don't want you to oppose, you don't want the state to impose it. So we want to be able to freely choose in the system in which we live the beliefs that we hold without being told or forced or cajoled into a belief.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we chatted about just fully transparently as we just got to know each other a few minutes ago right. is that some people from your background are simply afraid to be associated with PragerU or even with me.
Correct.
Because they're afraid to be labeled whatever lies and labels I've been labeled with, right? And like I mentioned a few things to you that people label me as, a white Christian nationalist or all kinds of things. And so when they do that and you hear those things, they intimidated you from coming onto this program as well and being associated with us. And I think this is really how these ideologues, the intolerant ideologues, are really creating division and conquering really the conversations because they're instilling
Correct.
fear in those of us who are willing to sit down and have conversations.
Correct.
And what an opportunity it is for us to talk about things that we may disagree with, but we might come up with agreement on things that make sense.
Correct. And they attempt to intimidate you. They attempted to intimidate me. And the basic idea is that it's guilt by association. It's some kind of contamination. So I've talked to you, you've talked to me, you've been perceived to be on the right, and the next thing you know, you can discredit somebody. So that's an excuse to also not do the intellectual work that you need to do to figure out a position. Oh, he's on the right, or he's, as opposed to looking at the evidence and doing the work and then coming up with a decision.
Yeah. Completely. So for those of us who want to get to know you a little bit better, tell us about your background. I came across your name both through my friend James Lindsay, who's been on this program before. I remember some of your work, but particularly I remember that you resigned as a professor,
right.
and you had a very powerful letter of resignation, which I brought with me, and I want to ask you some questions.
Sure.
But for those who are listening in, just a little bit about your background. Who are you?
Sure. My name is Peter Boghossian. I did my dissertation in the prisons, and I attempted to increase the moral reasoning of prison inmates and then help them on their journey of desisting from crime. And I was actively involved in epistemology, which is how you know what you think you know. I taught for many years at a former university, which I subsequently resigned from. I travel around the world. I have a nonprofit, National Progress Alliance, and we try to promote civil discourse. And I travel practicing this thing called Streit epistemology. I facilitate conversations among people who disagree. And I think, you mentioned James Lindsay. He's the co-author of the book. We did the grievance studies thing in, I think, 2018 to expose corruption in academic scholarship. And I resigned in 2021, and here I am talking to you.
So this was a couple of years ago when you resigned. Why did you resign?
I resigned because I couldn't do what the university hired me to do, which is to teach critical thinking and reasoning. I also resigned because we were doing an injustice to the students. So students weren't, and we see this today magnified, students aren't being taught how to think honestly and openly about certain issues, they're being forwarded certain moral conclusions, certain political conclusions, certain ideas about the world, certain ideologies by people who are hell-bent, absolutely convinced that they have the right answers to moral questions. So it's doing students a disservice. I couldn't teach the way I wanted to. And what I mean by that is just literally showing, okay, why would someone vote for Trump? For example, I mean, I didn't vote for Trump, but why would somebody do that? Why would someone think that's a good idea? Even that suggestion would be seen as outrageous, racist, bigoted, and homophobic.
For just bringing it up.
Yeah, for just bringing it up or for attempting to understand another position. So the goal is not to understand, it's an indoctrination mill. The goal is to replicate that ideology. The goal is to find oppression, remediate oppression, give people the tools, the critical consciousness to go in. Because remember, there's certain assumptions. Racism is the ordinary, everyday state of affairs. Every disparity in outcome is due to systems. There's a patriarchy. We could talk about heteronormativity. The society is oriented. So there's a set of assumptions, and the goal of the institution is to not only forward those assumptions, but to get students to believe in those things. And this is ubiquitous. This is everywhere, virtually everywhere in the United States now, and Eastern Europe, and the English-speaking world.
Did that come as a surprise to you when you were teaching a few years ago? I mean, so my background is education. And so when you speak about these things, I say, yeah, I've known this for a while.
Right.
I've seen, and I've seen it through this Marxist lens, right? Like our education system has been Marxified. Was that surprising to you when you had to resign? Or were you hoping that when you were working there, you would be able to shift that? I mean, I think of you as this optimistic person who can have conversations and hopefully change minds, and we can get into that. Is that why you stayed, or did you think that you could change things at that point?
Oh, I knew I couldn't. I knew I couldn't change things. I first started trying to understand what the problem was, and I was perfectly situated. I was in Portland, and I was at a university in Portland, and it was just the nucleation point of absolute craziness and madness.
Yeah.
And so by trying to figure out what was actually going on, it's not that I was a Nostradamus of any of this stuff, but by trying to figure out what was going on, I had a little preview of what was to come.
Yeah.
And I realized that it was a kind of imperviousness to evidence and imperviousness to reason, a way of looking at a problem as if you had the conclusion already and then you work back to the problem. So we know, for example, whatever it is that people are trapped in the wrong body, whatever it is, or that people can be microaggressed, or that everybody needs a trigger, whatever it is, trigger warning. And so we have that conclusion. Now we work backward from the conclusion to justify the thing we already believe. And the whole institution was captured this way. I mean, it's truly extraordinary.
And I don't think it's necessarily unique to Portland. I think we're seeing this all over the country right now.
Yeah, not only are you seeing this is a rather grim piece of information, but not only are you seeing this in United States institutions, but this is an export. This is a neo-colonial export on the part of the United States.
Yeah.
We no longer export the values that we used to, well, at least when I grew up, I'm older than you, democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, equal treatment under the law, Miranda rights, due process. Those things are yesterday. Today, we import very specific conclusions about race, gender, oppression, power dynamics, power struggles, overthrowing systems, problems with democratic institutions, why they have to be leveled, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think I am seeing this too, and it's actually quite embarrassing. Look, I'm proud to be an American, but for the first time in my life, I'm recognizing that it is America that is exporting bad ideas.
We are the problem.
Through our universities.
We are the problem. Yeah, not only, so there's a few things there. Not only are we the problem, but you cannot understand the problem unless you look at it through the lens of education in the universities. And you cannot understand that problem, I don't know if you want to go down this rabbit hole, but unless you understand teacher training programs.
Yeah.
Because that's the wellspring. That's really where the whole thing comes from. And so then we indoctrinate generations of students, and then we export those ideas, equity as opposed to equality. We export those ideas to the rest of the world.
Yeah,
I mean, it's shameful.
You give some examples in the letter that you wrote that I remember it from a few years ago, and it's just fascinating. You give examples of these bad ideas that we're exporting. You write here, brick by brick, the university has made this kind of intellectual exploration impossible. It has transformed a bastion of free inquiry into a social justice factory whose only inputs were race, gender, and victimhood, and whose only outputs were grievances and division.
Correct, and I stand by that. In fact, not only do I stand by that, but that turned out to be more prescient than I thought.
Could you give specific examples that led you to this conclusion?
Yeah, that's a big question. So to understand why this is happening, you have to understand that you have to understand the architecture of the system. So to get tenure, which is a job for life, it's usually 7 years, not always, and primarily it's because you publish in peer-reviewed journals. There is a deep-seated corruption, a deep-seated rot in academic journals. And journals will only publish, only might be too strong, but certainly in certain fields like gender studies, anything with the word studies in it, they'll only publish certain articles that forward very specific views about reality, very specific views about oppression, and very specific views about victimhood. The consequence of that is that the people who publish in those journals are more likely to get tenure and have jobs for life. The people who don't publish, and when I say those journals, I mean just broadly the suite of journals in humanities, they can't get published and then they don't get tenure. And then what happens is that the people who get published in those journals, they become reviewers of similar journals, and then you get this echo chamber, this ideological echo chamber. Adding to that, the professors then teach those articles in the classroom to their students. So that's the way that you weave in the indoctrination. And remember, it's been John McWhorter, my friend John McWhorter has a wonderful book, Woke Racism. The difference in this context is that this is not a religious movement. Like, you don't need faith for this. You just point to the body of evidence. You point to the corpus of evidence showing that, as I said before, racism is the ordinary everyday state of affairs, or fat phobia, or what have you. So it's a complicated problem, but the source of the problem is in the peer-reviewed literature.
So as a professor, you basically realize that if you don't subscribe to this ideology, you can't publish papers that would ultimately give you tenureship, right, or tenure.
Yeah, the likelihood of you getting a paper into a journal that contradicted whatever the narrative would be virtually zero.
I'm sure you've been asked this question so many times, but where is this coming from? Because what you're describing basically is the destruction of our institutions.
Correct.
If you
willful.
can have willful.
Yes.
So if you can have absolutely nonsense, bogus, peer-reviewed, expert opinions that are then taken and brought into America's universities as truth, then you're effectively putting a Trojan horse into our university system and then pumping out a bunch of kids who believe bogus lies.
Okay.
So who is knighting these people that are allowing this to happen?
It's not that it's nonsense. It's very much makes sense. So all of these things internally cohere to each other. There are through lines among all these various lines of literature. So the best book on this is actually James Lindsay. Helen Plucker was the first author, and James Lindsay's Cynical Theories. And just as an aside, that book sold, I believe, over 500,000 copies, and it was intentionally, like Jordan Peterson's book, it was intentionally left off the New York Times best-selling book. So they trace a genealogy of, basically it comes from postmodernists, the original French intellectuals, and it moved from there to what they call applied postmodernism, the application of these ideas of power structures and how to remediate power structures, et cetera. And now we have literally generations of people who have gone to college who have been indoctrinated by ideologues. It is, people simply do not understand the severity and nature of the problem. It is intractable, and I don't think it can be uprooted. I don't think there's any way to extirpate it at this point, given that people have jobs for life. And that's the raison d'etre of the institution. The raison d'etre of the institution is, it's not even, as Heather McDonald says, it's not even proportional representation. It's just finding someone who has an oppression variable in their background and using an equity-based system to guarantee that those people have positions of power.
So just to clarify, you're saying that many of these elite Ivy League schools, and including the school that you taught at, the reason they exist is to create division amongst Americans and to have them enlist in this game of victim bingo?
It's a little more complicated than that. This is how you think about it. So if you just look, if Harvard only, and Harvard has been in the news lately for good reason, we should probably talk about that too.
I'm getting there.
Okay, good. Yeah. So if Harvard only took the top 10% of applicants, Asian Americans would be over 51%, cold climate Asians. Whites would drop, I think, in the 30s, a few points. Hispanics would plummet. African Americans would go from 13% to 0.9%. So what is the goal of the institution? Is the goal of the institution to find truth? Is the goal of the institution to find people whose ancestors have been historically oppressed and to forward those people, to give them opportunities or positions of authority or what have you, like President Gay of Harvard University? So the university's purpose has itself shifted from its traditional purpose of scholarship, academic excellence, et cetera, to a kind of race-based, gender-based, looking at reality, teaching people how to look at reality through a lens in which there's a constant oppression, and they must, kind of rise up against that oppression and whatever, discharge their moral impulses by however one would want to frame it. But basically, they are both victims and bullies in their own story.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because to better understand what the goal is of our current universities will allow us to understand what we are seeing is happening right now. And people are just in complete shock. I'm not in complete shock because I feel like I've been in this for a while. Yeah. I actually think that the presidents who are running these universities are a perfect match for these universities.
Agreed.
Simply replacing them may not actually replace the problem in these institutions, 100%. Right? And when you describe to me that their goal is basically what I call victim bingo or oppression Olympics, then actually maybe they're doing their job if that's their goal, right? Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Coupled with ripping down the system. So President Gay of Harvard has been, Christopher Rufo, our I think Chris is your friend as well. Yeah. Our mutual friend uncovered through some extraordinarily good reporting, she plagiarized. I'm very confident to say that because I've looked at what she's written, her dissertation. I've looked at where the source material came from. I've also read that Chris posted on his Twitter feed exactly what the rules are at Harvard from plagiarism. And there are, and let me know if this answers your question, because I think it's a segue of something that we should be talking about. Many of her colleagues want to keep her in her position, and some of whom are claiming that this is a kind of racism, that they've gone after President Gay because she plagiarized, and so somehow that's inherently racist.
Do you think that these universities should fire
Absolutely not.
Any of these presidents? Why not?
Absolutely not.
If they're doing something wrong and everybody's upset with them and these are anti-Semitic statements?
Oh, that's different from the plagiarism.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, so I was just talking about the plagiarism. No,
right.
I think it's a wonderful thing if you have an academic fraud and total charlatan leading the world's most elite, prestigious university. I think it's a beacon for other people to see the institutional, organizational corruption. And she's the perfect figure. And I would be adamantly opposed to her being fired on the grounds that we now know. It's like when people tell you they hate Jews, believe them. Mm-hmm. I wrote the foreword to a good friend of mine's book, The Gift of Violence. When people tell you what they want to do, Hamas or whoever it is, we should believe them.
Right.
And so that's one thing about not condemning, and I don't like anti-Semitism, I much prefer Jew hatred. It's a much more precise term. But in the case of President Gay, I think it's wonderful to have, if there's any such thing as a sin in academia, it would be plagiarism. And I could not possibly think of a better spokesperson than someone who's absolutely conspicuously corrupt heading a corrupt university. She's perfect. So I'm against her being fired.
Do you think our universities can be saved?
No. No, absolutely not.
Firing the people
unequivocally
at the
not.
top won't change anything.
No, because, well, first of all, they have tenure. So they have jobs for life. They have manufactured bodies of literature that are totally untethered to reality. And I mean, it's not just as if you change the administrators or you change the faculty, but you couldn't even change the faculty even if you wanted to. So I don't think they're salvageable. So you have bodies of literature that are corrupt. You have the raison d'etre of the institution, which has been perverted. You have individuals who are ideologues who do not teach for truth. I mean, look, think about the struggle sessions, the DEIs. The whole university architecture is predicated on this idea of finding and hunting down people who don't agree with the narrative, particularly on race, gender, and things with identity level salience. These are not the institutions that you and I went to. So I do not think it can be saved. Like, unequivocally, no. And why should it be? Any effort to attempt to save it, then you're pulling efforts away from other, like University of Austin or Ralston or other institutions that are coming up. So I think it's a bad way to think about the problem. But if someone wants to spend their time like that, that's fine with me.
I mean, I guess in so many ways, you could have stayed there and said, let me try to save it. But
No.
you realize there's no saving to be
No, I
done.
want the whole system to be burned to the ground. Why would we want an institution that trains people and indoctrinates people into false views of reality? They'd be much better if they went to vocational school and took a trade. Or actually, it'd be much better if they just laid in the field and looked at the sky. I mean, why would we want to encourage going to an institution that teaches you false things?
Yeah, and the problem is that our universities are not fans of reality.
Correct.
And
So-
that's that.
So we should talk about that. So in any realistic combat-based sport, there's a corrective mechanism. There's a way to, when you fight an opponent who resists you, who doesn't want to lose, you can test your ideas very quickly. In academia, almost the opposite is the case. The corrective mechanism has been removed. Debates, for example, have been removed. So the debates are form of violence. I just for the record, I'm much. I think conversations are more important than debates, but debates absolutely have their place and their role. So that's been removed. Any kind of all of the corrective mechanisms have been absent. So any kind of a dialogue, any kind of a discourse, any kind of this is what these people would believe, not that you have to agree. And again, this is not on every issue, but it's on most issues. Challenging or questioning is seen as a form of epistemic violence. And there are entire lines of literature about this idea of epistemic violence.
It's fascinating. You know, there's another weapon that has been used against common sense on campus, and that is Title IX.
Correct.
And you wrote about it also in your resignation letter. And, you know, I'm curious just a little, you know, what happened there? And can you describe to people who don't know how dangerous Title IX has become now? It's really been weaponized.
Sure. So I signed paperwork saying that I couldn't go into the specifics of it. Unfortunately, I in my resignation letter, I published the most that I possibly could. But what happens is that I'll tell you one story that was particularly insane. So what happens is if you violate the orthodoxy, the moral orthodoxy, people can they weaponize offices of diversity, equity, inclusion. They weaponize federal law against you. So if you don't toe the party line, then they can come for you. There's another thing that at some point we can talk about bias response teams where people can file anonymous complaints against you that usually bypass traditional university architecture or hierarchies and go right to the president. But this is different. These are federal laws. So part of the problem with this is just a theft of your time. It just takes time, and needless to say, it's incredibly stressful. So I was told that I was not allowed to render my opinion about protected classes or teach in such a way that my opinion about protected classes could be known. There are literally entire departments that are predicated on forwarding narratives about race and gender. The whole gender studies department, that's all they do. The whole black studies, that's the whole thing they do. So I asked very specifically, like, why am I targeted? And what should I say if someone says, do you think African Americans should be put in chains? Well, I couldn't render my opinion about that because I was very specifically told African Americans are a protected class. You can't render your opinion about a protected class.
Even if it's an opinion that protects them against evil. You can't
Correct.
render an opinion
Correct.
on it.
But the more interesting question is, why me? Well, we know the reason why me. Because I was challenging a status quo. I was saying that we need to ask questions about that. Look, if we have an environment in which we're not allowed to ask questions, invariably, we're either going to have demagogues who come in with answers, or we won't have a moral infrastructure. We won't have a way to think about problems so that we can deal with them. And I don't even, it could be something as simple as like, should AI, and this is way out of my area, but should AI, if it develops sentience, should it be given rights, something like that, or animal rights, or vegan, or whatever. So we have to be able to ask questions. We have to be able to wrestle with opinions. And for a teacher to go in thinking or knowing that they have a right answer to the moral question and they're going to test students on it, and they're only going to give literature that agrees with what people already believe, you're doing the students a profound disservice. You are not educating them. It is a backward roadmap away from reality, and is a recipe for discord.
And people are penalized for thinking freely. I mean, that is what's so terrifying about all of this. It's not just professors and teachers that Title IX is weaponized against. It's also students, right? Like if a student basically says something that might hurt somebody who doesn't win victim bingo at that moment, right? They're not one of the more oppressed group. They can be accused of something and they're not even given an opportunity to defend themselves. That's what's so crazy about Title IX.
Right. And remember, there are these truths. Diversity is a big truth. Equity is a big truth. Inclusion is a big truth. And these are fundamental ideas. Look, these things didn't even exist. Certainly they didn't exist when I was going to college. And now they're placed as the highest values of the institution, and the entire institution is in service to these values. And the problem is that there's no opportunity to question if those values should be the values that should guide the institution, because asking that question itself, they have a whole infrastructure, linguistic infrastructure. It's a microaggression. You've harmed people. You've done a form of violence against people. I mean, it's really, the whole thing is, it's really rather extraordinary.
It's extraordinary, it's overwhelming, and it's scary because I have an 11-year-old kid. We're starting to think about what kind of education will my child get one day. So should we strive to send them to college? I don't know. I certainly don't want to send them to these Ivy League schools.
Yeah, I would never do that.
I mean, especially as a boy, right? I think the boys have become targets because Title IX has been particularly weaponized against boys. And so it's
on
very
that
terrifying.
100% agree. Christine Hoff Sommers' work on the war against boys has been excellent. And she was prescient in that when she published those are best-selling, fantastic books. Yeah. And now those problems have been amplified. So for you and your 11-year-old, I'm very confident to say by the time your 11-year-old is ready to go to college, there'll be new, robust institutions that are not ideologically captured.
You said something to me that sounded somewhat optimistic in this very pessimistic time.
Yeah.
And that is that you think that in a few months, this woke virus is going to become so visible that Americans are going to wake up and things are going to change drastically. What do you mean by that?
Correct. I think it's going to fall. I think it is. We can see it falling into ill repute. I think more and more people won't be afraid to speak out. I think it's led by the fact that at a fundamental level, people know that mutilating a child's genitals is wrong. I think that the trans thing woke a lot of people up, specifically the transition of minors and the testimonies of detransitioners. I think that a sufficient mass of people have become canceled or encountered the ideology, which is always interesting, by the way. It's because many people who proposed these ideas and who forwarded them, suddenly they've kind of, quote unquote, seen the light when they're accused of Me Too. I mean, just think about that. Me Too. Believe all women. Like, really? All women? You can believe all women. Defund the police. A uniquely idiotic idea. Abolish prisons. A uniquely idiotic idea. So we've been captured by slogans. People are waking up. I mean, Kendi now at BU is basically in disgrace. We've seen what happens. at the recent testimony at UPenn and MIT and Harvard. People are slowly waking up. They've seen the divisive aspect of the society. People are talking about a national divorce, which I think is a truly terrible idea. They're sickened by it, as they should be. They're horrified by it, as they should be. They're mistrustful. Oh, that's the other thing. More people now are profoundly mistrustful of American institutions. So, and that again, I would argue, directly comes from the academy, because we graduate people from the academy who then occupy positions in society, positions of leadership, and they take these really dangerous, divisive ideas with them.
I think that one of the reasons why people don't trust these institutions is because we feel like it's captured either through money or, frankly, outside adversaries. And the other issue is that, can you really trust an equity hire as opposed to hiring somebody based on merit? I mean, once upon a time, you knew you got into a plane and the person who is flying the plane is the best pilot possible. Now you have to wonder whether it's quota related. I mean, it's getting pretty scary.
Right. So people don't trust their institutions because they shouldn't trust their institutions, because their institutions are no longer worthy of their trust. The natural consequence to diversity hiring, the natural consequence to hiring someone on the basis of something other than merit, for example, in the aerospace industry, to fly a plane, to be a pilot, it is inevitable that more planes will crash. In surgery, it is inevitable, if you hire somebody not on the basis of merit, but on the basis of some other exogenous characteristic like race or skin color, it is inevitable that people will die. Mm-hmm. So the natural consequence of diversity hiring, by definition, has to be that the tasks in which they were hired, they will have higher fail rates. It has to be the case. Now, you can test somebody's belief on this very simply. You can say to them, would you have brain surgery if the person doing the operation didn't achieve that position because of their merit? Now, most people who advocate for this will say yes. Yes, I would undergo that surgery. And I believe them. But if you say to them, if they're a parent, they have to be a parent for this to work. If you say to them, I believe you, you have two choices. You have somebody who achieved they took their boards, they got into medical school of their own merit, and you have someone else who did not. You have someone else from some characteristic, whatever it was, trans status, what have you, they occupied that position. Who would you want to send your son or daughter to? Anybody who tells you it doesn't matter, they're lying to you. Mm-hmm. They're lying to you, because at core, they know it matters.
What do you think we do? Do we not send our kids to American colleges anymore? I mean, I know that you guys started a college.
Right.
But, there are millions of parents around America who are grappling with a very, very current problem. And that is, we have these 16, 17, 18-year-olds who we need to figure out what to do with them.
So I'll give you my response about this, and I'm sure you'll get thousands of comments saying what a horrible person I am. I told my daughter to not go to college. I specifically told her that I would love to see her be an electrician. Not only is there no shame, the vocations are honorable professions, and they actually make really good money too. So be a carpenter, be an electrician, be a plumber, start your own thing, start your own business. So so you're always going to have kids who want to go to college anyway because they want the college experience, and we're just marching toward hospice. This is just not doing us any good. It's dividing us as a country. I read polls, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, Greg Lukianoff, others have surveyed Americans of what they think about the universities. And it is astonishing to me when I read these polls that 80% of conservatives do not trust what goes on in the university. Mm-hmm. If people who are conservatives actually knew what went on in the university, there's no possible way that number could be 80. It would be 100.
It should be 100%.
Yeah. If anybody, and forget conservatives, anybody who believes, as I believe, and as I certainly hope you believe, that we need to formulate our beliefs on the basis of the best available evidence, formulate public policy on the basis of best available, and it doesn't matter if a leftist proposes something, could be taking trash out of the ocean. It doesn't matter what it is. If that public policy is founded on the best available evidence, then we need to enact that. That's the opposite of what we're seeing now. We're seeing ideological division and very specific claims about the nature of reality that we know are false. We know these things are false, and they're being forwarded by ideologues.
I'm really glad I pushed you on this question, because I think that we need to stand boldly and say this to parents, because parents need to hear it both from the academics and from CEOs, that we don't care if our kids don't go to these Ivy League schools.
Yeah.
People need to stop being afraid of whatever they think the culture is expecting them to believe in. We need to stop believing in these elite institutions that are ruining our country. And I use the word belief because I actually think it's become a religion. It's become a religion for people where they trust these places, these elite institutions with their children, with their life savings. And like you said, they pretty much turn a blind eye knowing that they're doing horrible things. These are horrible things.
Not only that, you're funding a machine to destroy the very values that I think we may have very substantive differences, and I don't want to underplay those, but you're funding a machine that promotes values that are toxic to our society and our democracy. So why on earth would you want to do that? Now, in all fairness, on the other side, Joshua Katz wrote, a very good friend of mine, a former Princeton professor, wrote a piece for Barry Weiss's Free Press about giving the other side of the argument. So the other side is we need to be competitive with our economic, I don't want to say enemies, that's perhaps too strong, but China, et cetera. Our engines of knowledge production are now compromised. So we need some kind of engines of knowledge production. We need some way to become not just competitive, but to be the leaders economically, particularly technologically. And so my argument to that would be we have enough people who will still go to college, and hopefully the STEM, that's the other thing, we haven't even talked about the STEM fields. You won't even in STEM get the most qualified people for the job, right? Because even that, the demeaning of the merit, for example, you have to write a DEI statement. UCLA has had some interesting stuff on DEI statements in which parents need to know that their students are being taught by the people who are the best in their fields. But they're not being taught by the people in the best in their fields. They're taught by people who are good at conforming to an orthodoxy, or at least pretending to. So I would argue that's another reason that makes it even worse. You're either taught by ideologues or you're just taught by people who are lying. You're just taught by people who don't value what's true. And the consequence of that has to be, over time, that you stop valuing what's true. Or you have to lie to yourself, or you have to pretend to not know something you know you know. You know what a woman, Hamas knows what a woman is. You have to pretend that you don't know something that you know that you know.
Right.
And if you do that long enough, the machinery will break down.
Yeah.
That kind of lying to other people is one thing, but lying to yourself is quite another.
Right. Completely. How are you wired to fight against this? And just to be blunt and openly transparent with you, I have found it very, very frustrating to be around some of my liberal friends who have seen the truth, but have not been willing to fight for different reasons. And I don't know if it's that they're weak or naive or whatever you want to call it. But when I put my neck out there and I started fighting against this Marxist ideology on campus and our schools in general, I was labeled as a right-wing extremist in every word under the sun.
Right.
And so many of my liberal friends would whisper to me and say, Marissa, we kind of agree with you, but, we need to be careful and we can't say this. And it's actually refreshing to me to find a liberal who is willing to shout truth and sit down with conservatives and say, hey, we actually have quite a bit in common here. How are you wired this way? I mean, is this something atypical for classical liberals? Do you think that you're able to wake up classical liberals and realize that they've kind of been fighting for things that are illiberal?
That's a very good question. So I think there are two parts there. Something that I'm trying to figure out myself that I can't understand. Like, I'm trying to figure out, like, why is it that some people never fell for this stuff? Like, why is it that some people just completely fell for it hook, line, or sinker? The whole thing, like the trans stuff, the BLM stuff, they just fell for like it all. Like every disparity in outcome is due to systems. That's like the defund the police thing. Like truly, that's one of the most idiotic ideas that I have literally ever heard. Like if there was ever a demonstrably false idea, that would be like, you can just believe all women would be the example I gave you. So that's one question. Like, I don't know the answer to why some people fell for it. By the way, most atheists have fallen for this hook, line, and sinker.
My reaction is that most people that I know who are religious, specifically religious Christians, who really walk with God, have not fallen for this thing because I think they have meaning and timeless truth. And so I worry that wokeism, I don't worry, I see that wokeism is a religion. It is all about emotions. And if you have nothing to fill in this God-sized hole in your heart, and you have a vacuum, and you're a teenager or just a person who's looking for meaning and belonging, then you join this camp that provides you some sense of justice and meaning and, let's all fight together and intersectionality and community. And, frankly, I'm not a Christian, but I sit there and I watch my friends who are religious Christians. They don't fall for any of that stuff because their heart is full. They have meaning.
That's called the substitution hypothesis. The idea that belief is the default, and it's like in the Game of Thrones. I think this is the best way. Have you seen the Game of Thrones?
Of course.
Okay, good. You're not dead to me. So in the Game of Thrones, the only reason people stop believing in the old gods and start believing the only reason people have new gods is they stop believing in the old gods. So is there, like, if belief is the default, now you may or may not know, Ayaan Hirsi Ali came out as a Christian in Unheard. It was a fascinating read, and many atheists are beside themselves enraged at this, but I'm not enraged at it at all. In fact, if this is a choice that she made of her own free will, I'm a big believer in cognitive liberty. I don't want people to tell me what I should believe. I don't want to tell other people what they should believe. I want the opportunity to question people what they believe, and I want them to have that opportunity to question me. But as long as those choices were made independent of coercion, I see no problem with that. And independent of like kind of a state sanction, that the state should have some intervene in what we believe. I don't know if, because I've thought about this, I've thought about this for quite a while. I don't know, and Phil Zuckerman has some interesting work on belief rates in Scandinavia, religious beliefs, and if something else, the people of Iceland have these wild fairy tale, like about elves and fairies run around, and only young kids can see them and such. I don't know if it's necessarily true that belief is the default. I asked Richard Dawkins this, and he said he hopes it's not true, because if it is, his life's work would be rendered impotent, or almost worse than that, meaningless. What I find interesting to your other question is, why do some people fight against it? I also don't know. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know something if I don't know it. I think that's one of my goals. I don't pretend to know things I don't know. I don't know why some people have fought against this and other people have not, have just gone along with it. This is the problem with creating a culture of fear, is you never really know what people believe. You just know what their verbal behavior is. And if everybody's afraid of a Title IX investigation, if everybody's afraid of being canceled or being hounded, you don't really know what people believe. And that's the thing that literally I've not heard anybody talk about, which is so important in this conversation, is if I don't know what you actually believe and you don't know what I actually believe, I only know what you say because you're afraid, because it goes along with what's morally fashionable, and you don't know I'm in the same boat, then I can never really know you as a person. I can never have an authentic relationship with you, because to have an authentic relationship with you, I can never be your friend. I have to know what you actually think and what you actually believe. And you have to have some ability to be vulnerable to me. And you have to have, if you look in the history of friendship, the literature from Aristotle onward, Aristotle and the Ethics onward, It's the idea that base people cannot be friends. You need to be friends with two people who are virtuous. And this ideology is so pervasive, it is a kind of corruption that tears through the fabric of society. It tears through the fabric of our institutions, yes, obviously, but what nobody is talking about, but we should be talking about, is that it makes impossible a relationship, a genuine friendship between people. That is a consequence, perhaps the most disturbing consequence of this, that's not spoken about.
I actually find that to be very interesting because I am in some communities where there is diversity of opinion.
Right.
And I am seeing massive struggle right now where people are afraid to speak. They're afraid to build genuine relationships. And it's developed into this culture of fear and discomfort. And I see it tearing these communities apart.
Right. So that is what I see happening to the anti-woke space now. The anti-woke space is becoming a large echo chamber. The anti-woke space is being slowly, it's kind of a mission creep, if you will, from being against this suite of propositions in a truly dangerous ideology, which most sane people can agree. Some people just want to opt out and not pay attention to it. It's becoming Christian nationalist. It's becoming increasingly intolerant. It's operating under some of the same parallels that we see in the critical social justice, canceling, demeaning. I find the anti-woke space to be deeply disturbing.
Well, I mean, I would be in the anti-woke space, and I think you're in the anti-woke space too, in that you basically left a very woke environment. You know, I think that the culture of fear and not being able to say what you think and then build a genuine friendship with someone because you can't actually say what you really believe, and then you don't know if what you're hearing, what the other person is saying, is even what they really believe.
Correct.
And then there is just this kind of fake friendship, and you talk about, I don't know, beach vacations and you know what shoes you're going to wear tomorrow, but you don't talk about anything of any sort of substance because you're afraid to offend the other side. I mean, that to me is that woke space. If you talk about the growing group of, I guess you would say, kind of like angry, frustrated Americans that some people may call the white nationalists or Christian nationalists, you know, is it growing? I think it's very possibly growing. Is it growing at the rate and the level of the woke DEI virus is growing? Probably not yet, but it is a reaction to the woke virus.
Absolutely.
Right?
I'll give you exactly what you're looking for. There's absolutely no question that it's a response to that. There's just no question.
Right.
The concern that I have is that it's mirroring the same, it's becoming what it hates. It's mirroring some of the same nasty values, specifically in intolerance of divergent thought, that is the hallmark of people who participate in wokeism.
What specific examples do you have that like concern you, that you've seen in that space and its impact on our society?
Conferences that I've gone to, there are prophylactics. You know, I just want to go down this. I want to linger on this for a second. If you're organizing a conference and it's more or less pushing an agenda, here's what I would strongly suggest for people, specifically in the anti-woke space. No panels unless there's genuine disagreement among people on the panels. No lectures with the possibility of the first person who starts the conference off who gives like a 10-minute lecture, this is what we're going to do. It should be debates, fireside chats or conversations, and street epistemology, which we haven't talked about yet. It should be, I will say I'm very sympathetic to conference organizers who will tell, and I believe them fully, and I'm positive this will comport with your experience, you cannot get people on the other side to speak with you. So in those cases, I think it's incumbent upon conference organizers to find people who, like James Lindsay or myself or Helen Pluckrose or have you, to find people who understand the position and create those arguments, and kind of like James did in his Oxford debate with Toby Young, but to find people who can best represent those ideas. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to have if you will use a big word, a pedagogical model. You don't want to have a learning model for people that mirrors the thing, especially if you're a free speech advocate. What you want to do is you want to find voices that may be disturbing or your audience may find dyspeptic, so that they listen to those voices so that they know that there's not an echo chamber. Like, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Right? Many people on the anti-woke space fall on one side, many people on the woke, in fact, virtually everybody that's another bifurcation. So I think it's really important to mirror those practices of free speech and open communication, which we're simply not doing now.
Okay, so this really ties into conversation about basically what you write about in your book,
Yeah.
and that is, to use a simple term, changing minds of people whose minds you think you might not be able to change.
Correct.
Or how to argue with somebody who's absolutely wrong.
Right, an ideologue. Right.
Do you think that we can change the minds of ideologues or of people who have come out of these Marxist indoctrination centers?
I think that's not the right framing of it. I think the right framing of it is that, can we give them the tools to help them either change their own mind or value the disposition of changing their minds?
Fair.
Because right now they're told, don't doubt your doubt. This is you're good. You're good people believe this. You're a good person. You believe this. That's a syllogism, and so I think we know this is possible. It happens all the time. In fact, in religion, there's a word for it: apostasy. People who were believers who left their faith, and in most countries with Islamic law, that's punishable by death. There's surahs in the Quran about that, in the Hadith. So I know that that's possible. The question is, what kind of a society do we want to have? What kind of values do we want to have, not only embedded in our institutions, but in our academic institutions, but throughout the democratic system? And we have to have an honest conversation about that. So here's, now I'm going to argue against myself. So I read a piece in the Epistemology of Democracy about my side bias. It was one of the truly the most disturbing pieces, a little article I've ever read. And basically it was that my side bias is the idea that your side is right and the other side is wrong. And the authors claimed, and this is where self-honesty comes into play, because I don't want to believe this, but I have to be honest about what the evidence is. My side bias is the most difficult thing to train people out of. In fact, it may be impossible. Whereas I can, in 5 minutes, you can teach someone the difference between correlation and causation, a causal fallacy, what is an ad hominem attack, personal attack on someone. But there's something about the tribalism from my side bias when people can't, not only they it's not that they lack the intellectual resources to see what's wrong, but they lack the moral courage to want to question those virtues in the first place. And so what they do is then they look to their landscape, their epistemic landscape, their belief landscape, and they pull data that supports the things that they already believe. Like what happens in the university system. We know that racism is the ordinary and everyday state of affairs, so now let's go look for data to support that.
Yeah. I think it's incredibly scary for people to walk out of that environment of confirmation bias, because then they are afraid that they're going to lose their community.
It's called an ideologically motivated moral community. If your community revolves around a certain set of beliefs, and you'll be excommunicated, if you will, or defellowshipped, or for the Jehovah's Witnesses, for believing those things, you may want to reconsider the community you're in. Right. So because in that case, even your relationships and your friendship would be relegated to you pledging belief to a certain set of ideals.
So how do you do that? For those of us who have kids that have gone to these, what I call left-wing indoctrination centers, Marxist indoctrination centers, how do we have these conversations with people whose minds we want to open, just to use another phrase, right? So just walk me through some good tips on how to do that.
Sure, we run through it and how to have impossible conversations. Here's the formula for how to do this in a nutshell. Your first order of business is you have to understand. So this is great if it's around Christmas time, if you want to avoid fights or you want to navigate a contentious conversation. This is the formula. Here you go. Your first order of business is to figure out what someone believes. That's your first order of business. And the way you do that is you repeat it back to them, placing the burden on yourself, right? So I just want to make sure I understand this. Do I have this right? And then you say what it is. Now, if they say yes, What you're looking for from you had Chris Voss on his show, hostage negotiations. You're looking for that's right, right? If you say that, then you don't understand. But yeah, or good, okay. If they say no, then you have to ask subsequent questions, follow-up questions, so that you understand what they believe. Once you understand what they believe, your next order of business is to understand why they believe it. And so there are only so many reasons people can believe things or claim to believe things. Someone told them, they think they have evidence, they think it makes them a good person, whatever the reason could be. So you have to figure out why they believe what they believe. And remember, at no point in this process are you making a statement. You're not making any claims. You're just trying to figure it out, and you're repeating it back to them. And in the same way that I believe this is the antidote to my side bias, here's the best question if you have kids you can ever ask them. Once you figure out what they believe, always supportive in that process. I'm again, vital to understand. Burden of clarity is on myself. Not, what do you mean by that? That's unclear. No, always on you. I'm trying to understand. Okay. That's vital because it creates an environment. It creates the right atmosphere. And we know that people will change their minds from positions of psychological safety and comfort. Not, oh, you moron, how could you believe that? So then here's the question that I would urge parents ask their kids, and do it judiciously only after you've understood their beliefs, particularly in the case of trans or transitioning. Under what circumstances would you be willing to change your mind? What would you need? Would you need evidence? Would you need testimony from people? Like, what would it take for you to reconsider? So when we go around the world and we do this, we'll put people on a scale. Strongly agree, slightly agree, neutral on the other side. So usually right before I ask that question, I'll ask someone, so if it's a one-on-one like this, I'll say, okay, on a scale from 1 to 10, how confident are you that that's true? How confident are you you're born in the wrong body? How confident are you that every disparity in outcome is due to systems? How confident are you that you can change your sex? Whatever it is. And then if they say, well, I'm 9 confident, and then you would ask, okay, that's very interesting. You'll always put on yourself, oh, that's very interesting. That's great. So you're 9 confident. So what would it take to move you to a 10, and what would it take to move you to an 8? And when they tell you that, then you can look at the reasons that they give you and see if they've calibrated their confidence and they're on the line, or they've given you the number that they should be on based, like if their confidence in their belief is warranted by the evidence and the reason they have for their belief. And it's a deceptively powerful question. What would it take for you to change your mind? What would it take, again, when you couple it with scales, what would it take for you to go from, whatever you are, 7 to a 6, if you're a 7 to an 8? Or you could say to someone, that's interesting, you're a 9 on that, but I'm kind of thinking I may be a 5. So what am I missing to get me to a 9? And then what they'll do is they'll just give you a free guided tour of their own epistemology, of their own belief system. They'll tell you exactly what it is that they believe that you don't get.
And what do you do then? You go and collect that particular type of evidence and you bring it back to them?
You do one of two things. If the reason they have justifies the confidence they have, then you would have to believe it too. Mm-hmm. Because if you didn't, you'd be insincere. What would the point of asking them the question be?
Right.
Because you're trying to figure out if they know something you don't know, you should know it too. Mm-hmm. But more often than not, you will find that people will extend the confidence in the belief beyond the warrant of the evidence. Mm-hmm. And these simple tools, it's truly, I'm telling you, it's not complicated. The most complicated thing about this is not figuring out what questions to ask. We put it in the book, and literally hundreds of videos. The most complicated part about this isn't intellectual at all, it's emotional. Mm-hmm. It's keeping your cool when someone says something that you find to be hurtful or, somehow harmful to people. That's the tricky part about this, and we talk about how to do that. But what you would do when someone tells you that is you would say, okay, so let me make sure I got this right, let me make sure I got this right, let me make sure I got this right. Well, what about if someone says this? No, you didn't say that. What about if someone says, you see the difference? That's much less threatening. Mm. What would you do if someone said this? Like how would we, team word, how would we respond to that? Or how would one objective word respond to that? And so those simple targeted questions, and that these have extensive pedigrees in multiple domains of thought, all aggregated together. Those will make the conversation very smooth and very easy, and more often than not contentious. So people who had some irreconcilable difference, the point will be not that you agree, but that you understand. So now when someone says to you, oh yeah, well, I think people can change their sex, you might not agree or people can't change it, but you'll understand exactly why they believe it.
So I think there are examples that both you and I can come up with where the answer that we would be getting to what would it take to change your mind on this issue, or where are you on it, is a 10, right? They're confident at level 10. I'd imagine that one of the reasons why you left the university was because you felt like there's nothing you can do to change their mind on these particular issues, right? And so there are frameworks, and I think they're growing, where people are just so married to certain ideological concepts that make no sense that even if you brought common sense, you can't change that.
Okay,
right?
so here's a line of questioning that you can ask. So let's say that someone says, I'm a 10 on whatever. You can change your sex. Let's just do that one. So how confident you can change your sex? I'm 10. What would it take to change your mind? What would it take to, not to bring it down to a 5, but just to nothing. Literally nothing. It would take nothing. Yeah. Okay, so here's one way to think about responding to that. That's very interesting. What would you do if someone else were here and I said to them, how confident are you that people can change their sex? And they said, not at all. And I said, okay, on a 1 to 10, I said 10. And I said, what would it take to change your mind? And they said nothing. What would you say about that person? Mm-hmm. So what you're really asking them is, what do they think about the fact that they're unwilling to change their mind? Mm-hmm. So, but the other thing is, when you ask people a question like that, even the very fact that you ask that question, what happens is, if I ask you why you believe something, more often than not, you're going to tell me why you believe it. And the very act of you telling me why you believe it talks yourself into increasing your confidence that it's true. But if I ask you, well, what would it take to change your mind? We're almost never asked that question. And so it's kind of a little wedge in there to facilitate some thought. And the key also when you do this is just a little technique, is you never rush in to fill the lacuna. You just sit there and you just look. If it takes 5 minutes, I literally never say anything. I just sit there. There's no reason to kind of spare someone's feelings. They're thinking through a process, and you don't want to usher them along. You just want to let them sit with it. Mm.
So this relies on some basic framework and assumption that they hold virtues such as truth.
Right.
For example, the truth actually matters to them.
Right.
That open-mindedness actually matters to them. These are virtues that I feel we used to teach young Americans. They were part of what we would consider as important to teach children. And I mentioned my background is education. I actually think that one of the things that we're seeing now is that we're not teaching these virtues. Many of them are based on Western civilization values,
Correct.
Right? That have to do, even just when I ask you, how do you have the courage, right? How do you have the courage to speak truth, to stand up against fear, knowing that it might hurt you, but because you value truth, you value courage. We're not teaching these things to kids anymore. We're teaching them, again, victim bingo.
Correct.
And intersectionality.
Correct.
And so in order to make this work, we have to first layer the foundation of the types of virtues that produce the types of humans that care about these things.
Correct. So there's a lot going on in that comment. So we could literally have a whole hour to talk about that. So let's talk about that in the context first, and then I'll segue to something else. We'll talk about that in the context of religious belief and atheism. So one of the main points of confusion among atheists and people who are believers, the atheists will say, well, you believe in Jesus or whatever it is. You don't have any evidence for that. But the people who believe in that, and just to be clear again, I don't believe in that. But the people who believe in that, they don't believe in that because they don't think they have evidence. They think that they have evidence. But what's really happening is that the person who is an atheist doesn't think either that they don't have any evidence at all, or that they don't have sufficient evidence to justify the confidence in the claim that Jesus walked on water, for example. Same with virtually any other faith, Dalai Lama reincarnating throughout bodies in time or what have you. So it's not that people don't value the truth. It's that people have either they weigh evidence differently. When you ask virtually anybody, woke person, not woke person, whatever it is, if they think that they believe things that are true, they're going to say yes. Let me give you an example. Remember how I said that we go around the world and we do that spectrum street epistemology, strongly agree. So we've added something to that, and I find this just fascinating. We've added something to that. So I'll give a claim. For example, the one we did at Stratford Station in London, one of these guys was Muslim and one of these guys was a Christian. And we said, I put the claim out, the two-state solution is the best solution. And so whenever somebody goes to this is going to speak to your point, I'm not going off on a tangent here. When someone goes to the strongly agree and strongly disagree line, we have them pick up a little whiteboard and we have them write the best reason they have for standing on the strongly agree. And the other person writes the best reason they have. So in this case, it was the two-state solution.
For Israel? You're talking about Israel?
Right. And so this is fascinating. When you do this with people and you say to them, okay, what do you think her reason is for believing? What is their best reason for believing that? It is astonishing. No one will be able to guess what the best reason is. Yet, they feel so strongly about it that they're standing on strongly agree or strongly disagree. And so, I don't mean to be disheartening, but this is a serious problem because we people can't even, these are very significant issues that we as a society have to grapple with. Mm-hmm. Whether it's gender or race or whether it's some other problems we haven't encountered yet, beyond the culture or AI, what have you. We don't even know, we're not communicating with each other. The behavior is not being modeled in college, for sure, to such an extent that we don't even know why someone would strongly believe or strongly disbelieve a claim. We can't even figure out what their reasoning is for that. So how do we function as a democracy when we don't even know why people fundamentally disagree or agree with ideas? Like that's a recipe for civil war. That's a recipe for catastrophe. And our universities are exacerbating those disparities.
What you're saying is exactly what we've been saying all these years. We are seeing that our education system, this is actually starts in kindergarten, but it becomes worse in college. We have a system that teaches people that the truth doesn't matter.
Correct.
It doesn't matter.
You can't be a relativist and an egalitarianism about truth. Those ideas don't mix and match. So you're absolutely correct. We need to start talking about virtues and what virtues we should have. And one of the things, to answer your previous question that I did not answer, for why some people speak out and why people don't, is because you're right. People lose their communities. No one wants to lose their community. That's the only thing people want more than to be right. They want to belong. They want to be loved. They want to be listened to. And so the problem that many people have is they fear that if they speak out, they'll lose their communities. And I know we have a mutual friend I won't name who's lost a lot because of this individual's position on trans. So here's what I would argue to you or to any young people listening to this. The quality of your interactions and your friendships, you will know exactly who someone is and you will know that they're your real friend. You will know because they will accept beliefs that you have and you will accept beliefs that they have. And the quality of those friendships and the quality of those relationships will endure. They will add more meaning to your life than going along with platitudes and cliches. And you literally will be able to walk through life with a sense of integrity. So why on earth would you either pretend to know something you don't know or pretend not to know things that literally everybody knows? If you look at on people's deathbed, like deathbed confessions, what people want. Nobody says, and I was just reading a piece about this, nobody says, oh, man, I should have worked more. It's always, I should have spent more time with this person. I should have, deepened these relationships. So if you want to deepen your relationships, if you want to actually have meaningful relationships, you need to do a few things. You need to be a person of virtue. You need to be a person of integrity. You need to not lie to people. The truth will be a shield to you. And if you're honest with people and they're honest with you, you'll be able to develop those kinds of relationships that will allow you to flourish as a human being. And if you don't, I'll be blunt, your existence will be sad and pathetic because you will always have denied yourself the opportunity to truly be loved and to truly be in a community. So I would argue it doesn't really take much courage if you actually know that that's on the other side.
Right. The reward of being in a virtuous environment is worth whatever sacrifice or standing up against whatever fear it is that you might have in this particular moment.
Right.
It's just worth it. And that's what we need to teach young people.
And one more thing I'm going to add to that. If you need one more value in order to make this make sense at all. And that value is belief revision, or the ability and the desire and even the virtue of changing your mind in the face of incoming evidence, changing your mind to agree with people who literally you wouldn't agree with anything else on, but in this one particular issue you think they're right. The ability to step across the aisle. Mm-hmm. So part of the problem is that we get into these ideologically motivated moral communities and we think we're doing good, we think we're being right, and then we fall back into the very tribalism that we've tried to fight against. So coupled with that, you have to have the ability and the desire to change your mind in the face of evidence. And that is a much harder sell for people because then they would lose those communities and then the cycle will repeat again.
How are you guys going to do a better job than the other universities at the University of Austin, Texas?
That's a great question. We're not going to be beholden to ideology. We've spoken to employers, so there's ideological concern, there's practical concern about faculty, there's concern about, there are multiple concerns. Funding. The first class, by the way, everyone has 100 people have a free scholarship, 100% paid for. But built into the structure of the institution is we are not going to be ideologically captured. Neil Ferguson has written a wonderful piece embedded in the Constitution that will act as a prophylactic against those kinds of capture. So we're also going to have world-class faculty come in. Our mutual friend Michael Schellenberger is there. He's going to talk about politics and censorship. He is an endowed chair. We have the university has $200 million right now. And what's really interesting, if you drill down on those, many of those donors are like $5, $10 donors. That's just extraordinary. The other thing is the major donors have been courting the University of Austin recently, not the University of Texas, the University of Austin. There's going to be no pathological genocidal Jew hatred at the University of Austin. It's a terrible thing that I would even have to say that, but that's just the fact of the matter, given our current situation.
Can I ask you a question about that? I know that you guys are big on freedom of speech.
Yeah.
And so you'll hear people say, well, speaking Jew hatred is freedom of speech.
Yeah, inciting people to violence is actually illegal. So there's a difference between saying, and just to be completely clear, we're talking about people advocating for immediate violence, like gas the Jews. I don't know if you saw in Australia, they were chanting gas the Jews in front of the Sydney Opera House. So the difference between criticism of Israel and those criticisms are completely, we should have those conversations. Or the Palestinian issue, we should absolutely 100% have those debates, conversations, however you want to frame it. But there's a difference between that and a genocidal Jew hatred, which calls for the murder of people.
What about comments like from the river to the sea? I mean, that would be almost like inference, right? It's an inference from the river to the sea.
Yeah.
Palestine will be free of Jews, right?
That's exactly what
the comment
that means.
So it basically means, well, if they're not in that land, where do they go? Do they get killed? So would the university infer that means genocide? I mean, so
that's a question that's way above my pay scale. I'm a founding faculty fellow. Here's what I know about it, that it's a university based on free speech. It's a university based upon open expression. If there are calls for murder of people, that we can say we can draw a red line. If I'm not going to threaten to murder you, and then just fly that under the banner, I'm not doing that. Fly that under the banner of free speech. Any of those particulars, there's an administrative body that adjudicates that. And I also think that the administrative body is separate from the campus. It's separate from the physical campus.
Interesting.
Which is interesting. Yeah.
When will it open for undergraduates?
It's opening this coming year, and they're accepting applications now. They've had faculty. So the undergraduate applications are absolutely fascinating. They've had truly legit world-class faculty. 700 faculty applied for 15 spots. They've had the applications, the quality of the applicants easily rivals the Ivies because people are sick of it. But look, it's an institution for risk takers, for people who are bold. It's an institution for people who want to work hard and are not afraid of really tackling and building and going out and making their way forward. And the institutional structures are going to support those people even after they graduate.
Super interesting and very exciting. I'm glad that you guys are creating an alternative for us. So we'll definitely be paying a lot of attention.
Well, we hope you send your at least you consider sending your 11-year-old there.
Save me a spot.
Absolutely. It's a tough applicant pool, but you should absolutely think about it.
Right. Well, hopefully he'll get in on merit and not because of his mom's connections.
That's what it is. It's 100% merit-driven. It's a pure meritocracy.
Oh, great. Well, Peter, thanks for coming on. It was great chatting with you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.